our technology is confidential and we can't fully disclose this in our R&D report. How do we justify our claim to revenue to avoid an inquiry? If Luke, you could maybe answer this one.
Yeah, that's fine. So we do see this issue across a number of our claimants. Sometimes restrictions are driven by classification requirements, or sometimes the technology is actually proprietary and the value of the technology is in the proprietary nature of it, and therefore the company doesn't want to reveal IP secrets where they don't have to. So I mean, this shouldn't deter you from making a claim, and there are a few things you can actually do to get around this problem. So I mean, the simplest thing to do would be to set out clearly in the report to HMRC that you have these restrictions in place, and for whatever those reasons are, you can't disclose details of your project. So what we can do there is then actually just focusing on the write-up, focusing on the write-up and the complexity of your challenges and the issues you've encountered, and focus less on the actual development outcomes. So we can discuss the type of technology you've had to use and why using it is difficult without saying exactly what you've done. And if we can make the case for non-disclosure well, and then as long as you present sufficient information to show the competent professionals understand the existing baseline technologies and the improvements need to be made and the challenges in doing that, we should be okay. I mean, but if you are working on a project and it's too sensitive to discuss in any way, another thing you can do is describe a similar project that you've undertaken as an example project, and revenue will accept that. And here you just really need to demonstrate that you understand the R&D legislation, and that you have a competent professional in the business who can assess that against baseline technologies. So you can do that with a different project than the one you're actually claiming, but just you use that to give examples of the type of work that you as a company undertake. But then finally, in really extreme instances where, you know, as a business, everything you do is highly classified and you have non-disclosure agreements in place, and you can't really discuss it in any way without violating those agreements. HMRC do have mechanisms where the non-disclosure agreements can be extended out to them, and then they can assess the eligibility of the claim by essentially running a closed meeting between an HMRC inspector and one of the competent professionals who's worked on the project. So yeah, I mean, you can claim a project where, you know, you can't disclose your technology for whatever reason, but you should still expect HMRC to take prudent steps to assess the eligibility. But if you talk with an advisor about that, then you can work out the best approach, and they can sort of advise you on what the best thing to do with revenue is. But yeah, I hope that was helpful.
That's great, thanks. So the next one that's come through is, you said competent professionals are an important factor for claiming eligibility. Our lead engineer doesn't have a degree in software development, but has worked in the field for over 15 years. Will this be a problem? If Iain, you could maybe take this one.
Yes, that does actually sort of speak to one of the issues in the tribunal, that the judge was sort of angling at, saying that the only way you could have the level of experience was by having the qualifications. But I think revenue understand that in real life, people change careers and work in different spaces, train themselves up. So I think it's around showing the level of experience, highlighting the type of work that you undertake, showing that you do go out and investigate the technologies. You're talking to different experts in that sector to understand possibly what's going on and what they're up to. It shouldn't preclude you from making a claim. It really is about, at the end of the day, showing you're up to date with that technology, you understand what's happening, and you understand really what other people are undertaking with it. So if you do know that, and you can show that that's the type of work that's going on, then that should be fine. But it's definitely worth, on the experience side, of just maybe setting out a CV for the person who's made the assessment and highlighting some key training or key successes within their career, so that they can see that it's someone who has actually invested time in understanding the technologies they're working with. So it shouldn't be a problem, but it's definitely one that there could be a challenge on it, and you need to be fairly robust with revenue with it.
Great. Okay, still getting a couple of questions coming through. So the next one is, there are many companies working on developing similar technologies to us. If when we start a project, we are making an advance to the sector, but then halfway through someone releases the same technology, is our R&D claim redundant? Luke, if you can maybe take this one.
Yeah, that's fine. So I mean, I guess in this instance it would depend, and I mean it's probably worth off starting by saying that actually there probably are a few misconceptions about the way the R&D tax credit scheme actually works, and one of those misconceptions is that only completely new development projects, that reinventing the wheel type projects, will qualify. But this really isn't the case, because you can actually have an eligible R&D project, and make a perfectly valid claim, even if multiple competitors already have the capability you're seeking. One of the things we'd be looking at here is if the information about how to achieve the capability is publicly available, and if it isn't publicly available, and the work undertaken seeking to find a solution will potentially qualify for R&D tax credit relief. So we'd be looking at the experimentation and the development stages to develop your own solutions. And despite the fact other companies having the same capability, if you've had to actually go through that process and come up with a clever way of doing that, then there is still potential for a claim. So we're focusing in on the underlying technology here when we're assessing the eligibility. And it's even the case that where a solution is publicly available, if your developers have designed a better solution that essentially does a similar thing in terms of features and functions, but with different underlying technology that can reduce failures or improve performance aspects in some way, then we should still consider claiming. So that's what we're really looking at when we're trying to understand if which projects is eligible. I mean, where we may have an issue is if your development is like for like to the technology that became publicly available, and here we might struggle to argue that you've achieved a technical advance. But you should keep in mind that a lot of valid R&D claims are around enhancing existing products or processes, or achieving similar capability to what exists but with better and different underlying technology. And that's what we need to be justifying to revenue in the technical write-ups. So I hope that was helpful in answering that question.
Yeah, that's great. I've got another one for you, Luke. Where does the eligible R&D start and finish with this kind of work? Are all the initial processes of getting data in the correct format before beginning applying the technology eligible as well?
Okay. Well, I mean, I guess the short answer would be that HMRC say that eligible R&D work begins when work to resolve the uncertainty begins, and ends when that knowledge is codified into a usable form. In terms of what that actually means in relation to development phases and phases of a project, well, typically the pure requirement gathering parts of a project and the commercial viability assessments that take place prior to the challenges being addressed and identified probably wouldn't qualify. But as soon as you begin planning the R&D project, and that's things like defining the technical objectives and assessing the feasibility and identifying key challenges that need to be addressed, that's where we can start claiming, and you should begin noting your costs if you're thinking about making a claim. And in terms of the data, yeah, it's the case that often these early stages can include gathering data and building data models and attempting to get that data into the right format. And ultimately, it's often the case that this type of work is a key part to actually developing the overall platform and forms a key part of the development project. And yeah, you can then claim those costs. On the other side of the project, I mean, once the development's been complete and the system's moved to production, you know, the claim might stop, but HMRC do also recognise that there are often post-release issues, and sometimes developers do have to go back and sort of make improvements and essentially carry out new R&D to solve those issues that have been identified post-release. And then I guess the other part that some claimants miss is the testing phases. So if you've got testing parts of your project that feed back into the development, and those help identify the issues that need to be resolved from a technical perspective, then we can also include that time as well. So there is quite broad scope. HMRC do set out quite a broad scope for the boundaries of R&D, and typically it's from the planning and feasibility stages all the way up to release and where the system's fully into production. But yeah, that was helpful.
Great, thank you. We've just got one final question, I think, for the moment. Are there any changes in the budget that affect the R&D scheme that I should be worried about? And where can we find the consultation you mentioned earlier? Iain, if you can maybe take this.
It's in terms of the consultation, we can send around where that is. It's on a government website. It's probably going to be easier for us to point you in the right direction to find that. But in terms of the changes, there is one big change that came through, which is around a PAYE cap. So that means that Revenue really want to give cash credits for their SMEs to businesses that are employing people in the UK. This is to try and prevent fraud, and companies are setting up shells and sending subcontracts around the world to inflate the claim or even make fabricated claims. So you have to be aware of that, because it is quite a broad definition, and the way they've set it up, that if you're paying limited salary costs at the moment, you may find that going on from April this year, your amount of cashback you can get will be limited to 3 times the PAYE. There are exemptions, and hopefully they will allow a lot of companies to carry on claiming. They are quite complex, and we've only really at the moment got the draft legislation. So when the final wording is released, we'll have a better clarity on exactly how that's going to work. But I think if you feel like you could end up in that situation of having more of your qualifying spend coming through subcontractors, externally provided workers, than coming through staff costs, it is definitely worth speaking to an advisor just to make sure, do you need to tweak your plans? Do you need to have a think about what you're going to do in the future, just to make sure that you maximize the benefit you can get in the UK, just for maybe bringing a couple more people onto the payroll rather than having them, I don't know, through dividends or having them in a separate UK company. So small changes can actually have a very big impact in terms of this new cap. But in terms of the rest of the budget, that pretty much was all we had in terms of R&D. There were some changes around capital allowances and increased benefits for buying assets. But I guess the main thing is the change in corporation tax will have an impact on the R&D claims going forward, that if you are a taxpayer, the benefit you get from the SME claim as it stands at the moment will be increased as we go into the higher rate. So there are a few changes, some of them beneficial, some of them could cause problems, but in the main it was a fairly quiet budget apart from the consultation, which is definitely worth having a look at, because it's trying to set the future direction for both a large company and the SME scheme, and thinking about how do we make the UK scheme as beneficial as possible and as competitive as possible worldwide, given that our scheme was set up back in 2000. Does it need tweaks? Does it need changing to sort of reflect what other countries have set in place? And I think in general it's very positive, and I think it shows the scheme is there and is there to stay. So if you want any more information, then it's best to get in touch and we can explain what's going on.